Welcome to Thank You for Your Service, Wisconsin Rapids Community Media. My name is Tom Heiser and I will be your host. Today we have the opportunity of talking with retired, after 24 years service in the U.S. Air Force, veteran Will Smith. Will,
Hi.
thank you for your service.
Oh, thank you, sir. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Okay, no problem. Basics. Where's Will from?
My dad was a Marine, so I traveled all over the country. About every 3 years we moved. So anywhere where there was beach. But I graduated from high school in Virginia, just south of D.C. But yeah, we traveled a lot, lived in Hawaii and California, and some very interesting places for a kid.
Yes. So it's kind of interesting that your father was a career Marine. You were career Air Force.
Well, to start with, when I enlisted, I was only 17 when I enlisted. I got out of high school at a young age. And my dad had done 4 years in Vietnam.
4 years?
Well, 3 of them were kind of a secret, and then 1 official. And then he says, if you're going in the military, you can do the Navy or you can do the Air Force. It's just anything where you don't have to carry a rifle. So the Air Force was the choice.
So you went in right after high school.
Right.
No college to begin with.
No.
Okay.
No college at all. Just straight in.
There's a lot of experience being in a career military family.
Yes.
Okay.
So
your dad gave you 2 options. Why did you pick the Air Force option?
one, more home time. The Navy traveled a lot. You get after your training, you're usually on a ship, and whereas the Air Force is more home-based. And I was looking for a future career. I was looking for a job or a career that would teach me something that could be used in the civilian workforce. So the Air Force could get me in fast, at least in the reserves, and they offered me the training I was looking for.
So you go to the recruiter. I want to join the Air Force. But your background, they say you had a familiarity with the military background. So you said they gave you something at your choice. What was your choice?
I took the qualification tests, and the recruiter just handed me the book. He said, pick one. So you qualify for just about everything you want. And so I was looking in electronics, because I had planned on going to Virginia Tech as an engineering major. So I looked on electronics. I found a school that was 8 months long. I said, I think that's what I want to do. And of course, this is during Vietnam, and one of the reasons I was enlisting in the Air Force was to avoid the Army and Vietnam.
Being told what you were going to do.
Yes.
So where'd you do basic?
Went basic in San Antonio. That's all Air Force basic training in San Antonio. So I did that in the end of '71. Got out in January '72. Headed for Denver, to the training base in Denver, which no longer exists, and spent the next 8 months there.
So going to basic, you knew what to expect. It wasn't like a culture shock to you.
Growing up in a Marine Corps family, basic training was easy. Air Force basic training was easy. The physical demands were there, but right out of high school, sports in high school and things like that, it was pretty easy for me. The discipline was
big difference between the two.
Yes, yeah.
Okay, so you're living in Virginia at the time, and did you fly out down to San Antonio?
I actually ended up enlisting down in Florida. Right as I graduated, my dad got transferred to Florida. And so I helped him move and then enlisted while I was there. So I flew out of Jacksonville into San Antonio.
Okay. Little question. With your dad being in service, I'm just asking this as a person that moves a lot. You make long-term friendships being a career military child?
It's harder because everybody's moving, and you're not always moving together. There was one one friend of mine in high school that I went to first grade with him in California. Graduated from high school with him in Virginia. So you run into people, but long-term relationships were difficult, you know. But everybody was in the same boat. So you made friends quickly. You know, you accepted each other quickly. How's that? That's a better term. And because everybody had the same issues. Yeah. I never really kept up with a lot of people from high school, you know. But I have brothers and sisters that did track our high school people, so I get the word.
So you never really went to a high school reunion?
I went to one. It was my 10-year reunion. It just so happens I was stationed in Washington, D.C. again by then. So it was only 30 miles. So I went to just see what was going on.
Okay. Any other friends going with you into the Air Force at that time? Or
No, it was just independent. It wasn't like we went as a group or, you know. Most of the people I went to high school with went to college and actually became officers. Most of them were military. So
that was the next question I was going to have is, of the friends that you had, being a career child, how many of the other ones went in the military also, or, you know, rather than just going into civilian life once mom or dad got out of the service? A lot of them stayed in or went in on their own?
Well, I've got a brother that flew C-130s, retired pilot. I've got another brother that was in the Coast Guard just for 4 years. And my sisters, 3 of them married military guys. So, yeah, we were military minded.
So even your friends in school?
Yep.
Same thing.
They all went in the military, pretty much. You know, very few of them went the other way. It was just ingrained in us, you know.
So it's like a lot of families, whether it's military family or civilian family, so oftentimes children will follow in the footsteps of a parent.
Yes. Not exact, but similar. Like I
Right.
said, I was Air Force, but my dad was Marine. But
Still under the military umbrella.
The discipline of a military life didn't bother me, you know, and that is an issue with a lot of people. It is a different life.
Oh yeah.
So,
Moving so much.
and moving, and the impact that doesn't affect the military member as much as it affects their family. You know, having the whole family uproot and go. For me, I was just going to work at a different place, and maybe on a different aircraft, but it was pretty much the same. I was in the same environment, regardless.
Okay, looking back to your childhood, your family never really bought a home, did they?
Well, they did, because my dad he was an officer, and he knew he'd be around for about 3 years at a time. So they bought a couple of times. But most of the time we stayed in base housing. You know, it was just very simple. We had the facilities, you know. So, but there was once or twice that he bought a home.
Because turning over, because now you're moving to another place, now you got to turn it over.
Yeah, it's a problem.
The cities that are around the military bases, very focused on the military lifestyle of that base.
They're very aware of the base, and a lot of their economy comes from the base. You know, they have to admit, if you have several thousand people working on that base, their money, their income is going to come out to the economy.
Mm-hmm.
You know, in the stores and the rental and the housing and everything else. So they're aware of it. Some are more friendly than others, depending on the reputation of the base you're at. But generally, yeah, they're pretty military oriented.
So the selling of a home is, the realtors are used to that.
Yeah, it's all the time. Yeah, big turnover, you know, and so yeah, it works pretty well.
Okay. So you get down to basic. You go to your, in the Army it was AIT,
Yeah.
Advanced Individual Trainer, as some of the...
Or technical school.
Right.
Okay.
So what did you go into exactly?
The
What you
field
talk
was
about?
called Test Measurement and Diagnostic Equipment. anything that measures anything has to have a standard. And the TMDE people make sure it's accurate. I could work on micrometers, torque wrenches, scales, and then all through the electronics up through radar simulators, atomic clocks. Anything that can be measured, there has to be a standard for it. So that if you use a piece of equipment here and take that piece of equipment to California, it works exactly the same. And the aircraft, if they're serviced here, will work exactly the same if they're transferred. Because back in the beginning, 1,000 feet elevation wasn't always 1,000 feet elevation,
Mm-hmm.
So they standardized it, and that's what I did. So worked on everything.
So it's kind of like the weights and measures of the military.
Yes. I focused mainly on the electronic side of it for most of my career, but I had to know how to do the physical dimensional parts as well. Fairly specialized work, but I had to be able to do it as a supervisor. So.
Okay, because you took this, 8-month school, I think you
Mm-hmm.
said, I know the military sets your enlistment by
Yes.
how long your school is. So the usual Air Force enlistment was 4 years.
And that worked. That held. 4 years was what I enlisted for. So
Originally.
Originally, yeah. And then it just worked out that I stayed in. I was married at the time when I enlisted. I had a young baby. By the time I finished technical school, I had a young child. And so it worked out well to stay in for medical reasons.
Okay. So now you're finished with, we'll call it technical school,
Okay.
use your term.
Yeah.
And where did they decide that the Air Force needed you?
This is where my career became interesting. I went to a school that was used extensively in Southeast Asia. We had 4 shifts. So there was 4 classes graduating every week. And every other class went to Southeast Asia. And everybody in my class went to Southeast Asia, and they sent me to South Carolina.
South?
Yeah, it was still south, and no one knows why, because that's just where I ended up, So I ended up going to Charleston, South Carolina.
And the name of the base?
Charleston.
Just Charleston, okay.
Charleston Air Force Base.
Okay.
So.
And you get there, and now what are you doing?
Okay, it's just finishing my training, trying to upgrade my training, get my skills up. Working on the aircraft, it was a airlift command, so we had C-5s, C-141s, and all of their associated equipment came through our laboratory. But I was getting my basic skills. I worked on meters, oscilloscopes, frequency generation, all the basic electronics equipment that there was.
So you're doing all the calibration and stuff like that?
Calibration and repair. So, yeah, so it was busy, but it was actually fairly routine. When I got to Charleston, they told me not to settle too close because I'd only be there a year and probably be going to Europe because that's the airlift bases were like training bases for overseas. And so I figured I'd be going to Germany or something in a year. But I spent 4.5 years in Charleston. So it was a good base. I was able to really do my skills. And of course I was an NCO by the time I left there. And rank is slow in the Air Force, but the lifestyle is quite comfortable in comparison to the other services.
So with this training, when you talk about professional training, was that like an OJT when you first got there until you made?
Right. It's a skills upgrade, OJT, and we had specialized schools too. I went back to school to learn how to work on radiation detection equipment. That was a 3-week school, just on working on Geiger counters, And so we had many additional schools to go to, and that's one that I did attend when I was in Charleston. They sent me back to school for that.
And when they said back to school, was it in Charleston, or where did you have to go?
That one, I actually ended up in New Jersey. They sent an instructor from Denver, from our school in Denver, to New Jersey. So both bases, McGuire Air Force Base and Charleston, could both send people to that school. It was easier to send one instructor than have everybody go to Denver. So that was fun.
Interesting. So you re-enlisted in Charleston
Yes, I did.
for another 4.
Yes.
Okay. And stayed within your job or your MOS?
I was in that same MOS my entire career. Different facets of it, but still, the Air Force didn't break out sub jobs within the MOS at that time. So,
I know sometimes people can re-enlist and then they can get a school, or they can change careers, paths.
yeah, I didn't need to do that. I was sent to school frequently. I had a lot of additional training within my career field, and but that came a little later. To get out of Charleston, I got an assignment notification after I'd been there for 4 years, and it was to Panama. And so I went down and talked to the personnel people, and they says, well, yeah, they want you to teach electronics in Spanish. I said, no habla. I don't speak Spanish. And so they tried to get me into Presidio in Monterey, California, to language school. Couldn't do that. So they found someone who spoke Spanish to take that assignment, and they sent me to Keflavik, Iceland. Completely opposite direction.
Temperature-wise also.
Everything about it was different.
Okay, so getting back to that
Yeah.
Geiger counter school kind of intrigues me, because you're talking about latter part of the 60s, early part of the 70s.
This is the mid-70s by now, getting towards the mid-70s, yeah.
Cold War.
Yes. And the readiness, there were a lot of Geiger counters on the base, And we had radiation sources in our laboratory, well secured, that we used to test. Because radiation, the closer you are to it, the stronger it is.
Mm-hmm.
So we knew exactly how strong it was, and so we just move a little farther away to get a different reading. And these were computer-generated charts to tell us exactly what to do to test these instruments. And so we could test them, and fairly safely. We were exposed a little bit, but we did everything we could to keep from being exposed ourselves. And we had our rules of dealing with these sources, radiation sources. So
It's just interesting, with the nuclear talk of the Cold War.
yeah,
Being a Geiger counter guy, isn't that kind of like a bomb detector, where you're going in, all of a sudden you're getting these
that's what it is. It's what they use to look for radiation, after an event or before, and so it was important equipment, and it was just radiation detection. The old Geiger Mueller tube worked differently than you would think, so it took a special school just to learn how to work on them.
If I'm looking at you and saying, okay, so you now have an event, and they're going to send you out there, is that kind of...
No, I just worked on the equipment.
Oh,
And then they had the specialists that would use that equipment. And in my whole career, that's pretty much what it was. I made sure the equipment was up and ready, and then someone could take the equipment and use it and be assured that it worked right.
okay.
You know.
When you're working on this equipment or you're testing it, do you have to wear anything special like they do nowadays for...
No, we had procedures where we didn't have to have the lead shielding, and we had the equipment designed well enough that I would set the Geiger counter at a correct distance. Then I would open up the source while I was off to the side and protected, And we had telescope and mirrors so we could look at it.
So it's like when you get an X-ray taken, you all see the technician walk
The
behind.
technician walks around the door. Yeah. Yeah, we were pretty safe.
Okay.
There were times,
Going
but
to-
we won't. Yeah,
Statute of limitations were.
yeah, that's true.
Okay, so now you get sent to Iceland. Was that ever on your radar to go there?
No, it was not on my radar. It was a different aircraft instead of cargo. It was F-4s. Now, this is early enough that the F-4 still flew there, and it was just a different world. Small organization because it's just one squadron of F-4s on a Navy base, where the Navy flew their P-3s and their sub chasers. So the whole base was Navy with an Air Force contingent. So it was a year, and I did that. I did that unaccompanied. It was 1 year unaccompanied or 2 years accompanied, but it took about a year to get your family there. So I went with the unaccompanied, and they didn't have the medical facility for my daughter who had some medical issues. So it just worked out best to leave them home and go on myself. And so again, it was working long hours. Well, a lot of the hours were, I worked a part-time job just to keep things going. I was a cook at the USO. We had some fellow from the Midwest came into the USO, and they said, there's no place to go in the evening because to leave the base, you had to go through customs because that was the international airport. And so the USO directors, this guy came in, he says, have you ever heard of a fish fry? And so I worked a fish fry for 8 months, every weekend, all weekend, and gave the guys someplace to go in the evening after the clubs. And it became the only self-supporting USO outside the continental United States. We made a lot of money cooking fish, and it was right next door to the Air Force barracks. So
There it goes.
yeah, gave us something to do. So
The country of Iceland gives many people different mental concepts
Yes.
of Iceland. As a person that's been there, describe Iceland a little bit.
Iceland's beautiful, but it can change quickly. The natural resources of Iceland with the geothermal steam and the beauty of the waterfalls and all along the coast, it's very active. The interior part of the island is cold and the glaciers, but the coast is all very beautiful. They raise all their vegetables in greenhouses. I mean, it's just miles of greenhouses, all heated by geothermal steam. The houses in the villages are generally concrete, but they're all painted these garish, bright colors. And what we were told is that helps with their suicide rate. Because in the winter, everything is so gray. But having this color helped. But I used to, being a cook at the USO, I also drove on some of their tours. Anything to do, anything. So we had a Volkswagen bus that I drove around, usually in the southeast or southwest part of the country, where I could reach from the base, which Reykjavik is on a peninsula that sticks out the southwest corner of the country.
So you got the ocean keeping the coastline.
Ocean keeps it there, but the current, an Atlantic current, runs right up through there. So when a storm comes in, it comes in fast and it comes in hard, and there's nothing to stop it. The jokes about getting behind a tree in Iceland are true. There aren't any such thing. The wind blows, and the temperature, the weather can change very quickly.
So the term nor'easter also affects Iceland.
Yes, it's the same current, same ocean pattern that affects it, and it can have some tremendous storms. But on the other hand, salmon fishing in the summer, very popular. A lot of fish that we eat caught there, North Atlantic cod. So, like I said, having a fish fry there, we just go down to the docks and buy it right off the ship,
Well, you see Icelandic this or Icelandic that in the stores.
Their wool was it was almost waterproof. Their sheep were so hardy that their wool was almost waterproof, the oil in it or something. So, yeah, it was a great country. The people were friendly. Almost all of them spoke English. Sometimes they hesitated because they didn't want to sound bad. But all of them would speak English, so it was very easy for us. So it was a great year.
Interesting country.
Interesting country, yeah. Yeah, I wouldn't mind going back just to visit in the summer. So.
Yeah, because they're a little bit north, so they don't get all the sunshine.
No, and their summers are cool. They're pleasant, but they're cool. But and it does get cold. Oh well,
Iceland.
Being from Wisconsin, it does get cold.
Yeah, okay.
It's just part of life there.
So you're done with your tour in Iceland. Done where have you re-enlisted up there, or are you still?
I was still in because that was just 1 year. I was still in. I had some time left, and then they sent me to Washington D.C. And it was interesting because in my career field up in Iceland, there were 12 people there, run by an E8, and by now I was an E4, and one of my best buddies, another E4, and the E8 and the two E4s get sent to Washington, D.C. I got shanghaied by that E8. Me and my buddy, we didn't want to go there. We wanted nothing to do with Washington, D.C., but that's where we went. And it was because this E8 wanted us.
Work together.
At Works, that's the way it worked. He knew our work ethic and all that, so he dragged us along with him when he went back to D.C. He had been in D.C., volunteered to go to Iceland for a year, as long as they sent him back to D.C.
It's so interesting when I talk to veterans, they want to do the United States, but usually not, like I said, D.C.
Right, right. It was expensive. They didn't have the special pay incentives that they do now to compensate for the high expense areas. Interesting part, I showed up at work in Washington, D.C., and the boss there says, "Have you unpacked?" I said, "No." He says, "We're sending you to school." And I became a timekeeper. I went back to Denver, and I learned how to maintain atomic clocks because some of our customers needed that kind of accuracy in timing and frequency. So, like I said, I went to a lot of schools, so at various times. And the Air Force doesn't have the incentive. If you go to this school, you can get promoted, or it didn't work that way in the Air Force. But I did get the opportunity to go back to school, and then once that E8 got a hold of me, he sent me many times. Now that tour was a 4-year control tour because we were presidential support. And everybody there was going to be there for 4 years. No trainees authorized. So they are all at least journeyman level technicians. So work-wise, it was a dream. We had so much experience that we didn't have to worry about training people.
So what base were you attached to?
I was attached to Andrews, but I was physically located at Bolling Air Force Base, which is in D.C., directly across from National Airport. It was a non-flying base. They did have a helicopter pad, but that's where the cavalry was in the Civil War. So you hear about Anacostia, the naval station, where we were attached to it on the south. So we were right there inside the Beltway, but we were an operating location. We belonged to Andrews Air Force Base.
So doing the work that you're doing, security clearance?
All I needed was a secret clearance. I worked for people that there was one outfit I worked for, it took our boss 1.5 years to get the clearance to go in their building. I didn't need to know exactly what they were doing. All I needed to know was their equipment worked properly. There were some guesses I could make based on frequency bands they were using and things like that. But I didn't need to know exactly what they're doing. And they couldn't tell me. And that was fine with me. So just a secret clearance, because there was some classified frequencies I had to work with, specific, but not many.
It's interesting that you use the term that I'm somewhat familiar with as need to know.
Absolutely. and some of these outfits, well, Defense Intelligence Agency, and they all brought their equipment to us there. And, any federal agency could come to us for help. We just work on it. Like I said, this is your piece of equipment. Give me the manual. I'll make sure that everything it does accurately. Then what part of it you use
is up to you.
That's up to you. And there was some times that we'd run into something that would be extremely expensive to fix. We'd call them up and it says, "Do you need this function?" And if they said yes, well, we fixed it. If they said no, we said okay. We could write off that function. But so yes, it was a great place to work because of the skill levels and everything. Horrible living because it's expensive. But then they, and I'll give them kudos, President Reagan gave us a big pay raise. And they started the variable housing allowance, all the allowances for high cost areas. And it brought such a relief, especially to the younger guys. I had people working for me that were on food stamps,
Mm-hmm.
That's just the only way they could make it, and living in places that I hated driving through the neighborhoods. But so the pay improved, it eased up, and it was a great place to work because of that. Recreationally, we had the Chesapeake Bay for fishing, and so it was pretty easy living if you got used to living in a city. Which
you mentioned you used the term customers.
Yes.
And many of those had just 3 letters, didn't they?
Yeah. Yeah.
But it's government equipment.
It's government equipment. We'll work on it. We don't care if they're contractors or, that's part of their contract with us. They're doing certain work for the government, and in return we gave them support. And at this time I was working more into microwave equipment and things like the identification friend or foe and the radar, aircraft radar. I was working specially on that sort of equipment. Air navigation equipment, simulators.
So you're seeing things from when you first went in, what you were repairing, how technology is progressing.
And I'm working on more and more complicated equipment rather than just the basic electronic test equipment. I'm working on far more complicated equipment. So as your skill level goes up, so does the demands. So I could still do a micrometer or a torque wrench, but only when absolutely necessary.
And you're starting to see the parts getting smaller, the diodes. And
oh, yes.
We're not going from big tubes anymore. We're going to little.
When I went to school in '72, we talked about transistor theory, and there were some transistors, but most everything was tubes. And now we're starting to get into microprocessors, and we pretty much had to learn that on our own using the technical manuals that came with the equipment. It's doing the same thing as the old tube stuff did, but doing it in a far different way. Mm-hmm. And I caught a lot of that going to these special schools. They were working on newer equipment, and so I'd get some help on picking that technology up. But yeah, it was hard to keep up because things changed so fast in that world. So
now you're in Washington, D.C., and apparently your second enlistment had ended and you re-enlisted in Washington,
I was pretty much, I was going to be sticking around for a while. And only got in trouble really one time in Washington, D.C. That was a 4-year tour. I didn't want to be there. I tried. And the other E4 that came with me from Iceland, the two of us, we were pretty much attached at the hip anyway. We tried everything to get out of there. Instructor duty, recruiter duty, special duty with the offices, OSI, the Special Investigations. And all of them told us, hey, as soon as your 4-year tour is up, come and see us. We'd be glad to have you. And one day we're talking to one of our customers, a lieutenant colonel that ran the ham radio station, the Mars station in the Pentagon. He worked for the Air Force Chief of Staff, but he did this Mars thing. We were working on his equipment, he was talking to us, and he says, but aren't you all volunteers in this organization? Well, we gave him an earful. And a couple weeks later, both my friend and I got assignment notifications. We'd only been there a year and a half by now. Got assignment notifications to go to Washington State. That lasted 2 days. We had the 2-star general in charge of Andrews and Bowling. Walked in, he says, I want to see these 2 guys. Well, that was the end of our assignment. And we got the Eddie Arnold Green Acres speech, And he finally said, boys, you're going to be here for as long as I have anything to say about it. So we both spent a little over 6 years on that 4-year tour. We had to get promoted twice to get out of there. And so we were there for 6.5 years. Fortunately, I met my wife there. She was active duty. We lived in the same co-ed barracks, which was brand new. Back then, they didn't have too many of those in the Air Force. And got to know each other, and so we got married. If I'd have just done the 4 years and left, probably wouldn't have happened. So I owe that to this general, that he made this happen for me.
Who would have known?
Yeah, who would have known? So,
okay, so you're in the Air Force, E6.
I made E6 there. Yeah, while I was still in Washington D.C. Yeah.
And you met your current wife there.
Yeah,
was also in the Air Force.
Mm-hmm.
Was not an E6.
No, she was personnel, and she decided to get out. She worked for the headquarters of the Air Force Reserves, and they were moving from Washington, D.C. to Denver, and she didn't want to leave. So she got out and went back to school, And then, of course, after that, I started dragging her around the world. So that was fine.
So I've spoken to other people that have married other service people. And they say sometimes that's really, really hard because you might go to Iceland and she might get Hawaii.
There's no guarantee you'll be assigned. They say they try. My wife being a personnel specialist, it was probably feasible that she could go anywhere I got assigned, Any major base, any full base, there was a good chance I could be used there, But there was no guarantee.
Right.
And we didn't have any children, so it was easier for us than many. Well, if you have children and you're both married, you have to have elaborate plans designed and certified, so it was just easier for her to go ahead and get out and pursue different things. She could have had a very good Air Force career in personnel, but she decided not to. And so she followed me around, and she got into the civil service. So she worked for the military frequently on my different assignments, but not active duty anymore.
Okay, so she gets out, and you've now done your 6 years in your 4-year
Mm-hmm.
enlistment. Now where do you go?
England. I went to Upper Hayford, England, which is about 20 miles from Oxford. And it's an F-111 base, so another fighter, different aircraft. And so I got up there, and of course as an E6, I was a supervisor. So I either running shift work, running a shift or or a section, specific equipment section. And I worked quality control a lot up there, inspecting the equipment other technicians had finished and certified, making sure they followed all the regulations and the technical orders and got it right. So
Little boxes had X's in them.
little boxes had X's in them, yes. So I did a lot of quality control and a lot of shift work, shift supervisor work up there. That was in the mid-'80s, and that was one of the bases that flew over to Libya to visit Mr. Gaddafi in the mid-'80s. Ours were the electronic countermeasures that flew over for that attack on Libya. So
The radar jammers and whatever, frequency jammers.
And that was one of those things that several weeks before that, we were getting requests from our avionics people, which we worked with very closely. And they had to get all of their stations, all of their equipment up 100%, no limitations. And they'd been in a peacetime environment for a long time. So we went several weeks working many hours to get them up to speed. We didn't know why. So I'm out doing my normal jog one morning, 4 in the morning, and I ran into a clerk, an admin person in base housing with an M16. Scared us both, but he was armed. And I get home and turn on BBC, and there it was, the attack on Libya. So we knew something was happening, but we didn't know what.
So being in the position that you're in and the civilian world, here's that some planes flew from here, did a job, and came back. But to get from here to do the job, there is a lot of dominoes that have to be upright and in line.
Everything has to, and the stories then, they had difficulty with certain countries being allowed to fly over, but that's well above my pay grade. I knew that what I supported was correct. The aircraft should fly and operate exactly like they're supposed to. The politics of it, that's not our job.
Right. But politics aside,
yeah,
your equipment has to be
I
spot on.
I had to get the equipment up for the station, the avionics operators that would work on the boxes that go in the aircraft to make sure everything is perfect. We worked a lot of hours. A lot of guys put in a lot of time.
And this wasn't 2 days before.
Oh, this was weeks, yeah. Several weeks. They knew we had issues, and so they gave us plenty of time. And we just knew something was up. Right. We didn't know if it was a special inspection coming up, and or what. But we knew something was happening, but we didn't know what.
Okay, back to England.
Yeah.
You're now driving on the wrong side of the road.
Yes, we are.
How did their culture and your American background conflict a little bit, or was it real interesting?
It blended well. They were very, for the most part, very accepting of us. There were certain parts of the country that weren't. We were bringing the nuclear weapons in, and there were parts of the country that were adamantly opposed to it. We were not even allowed to talk to those people. We were U.S. Air Force tenants on RAF bases. So anything dealing with the protesters and all that was left to the Ministry of Defense police. We couldn't even talk to them. If they blocked the road, just stop your car and wait. The police will be along soon enough. Don't talk to them, don't honk, nothing. It was, so we had to accept their culture. Mm-hmm. We weren't in our country. We weren't in America, and had to accept that. But for the most part, they were very friendly with us, because we did have a history.
Right. So you're in an RAF base.
Mm-hmm.
Are you working on RAF planes as well as
No,
Americans?
it's just American planes at this place. You know,
Okay.
we had a few RAF officers in the office, but no, it was functionally operated by the U.S. You know, we had some guards at the gates and things like that, but that were English. But one of the funny things was things like civil engineering. We weren't allowed to have civil engineers, construction workers. We had to have civilian contractors for that. So what do you do in a wartime environment? You think those guys are coming to work? No. So you take all your electronics people and all that, and you teach them how to repair runways. And that's one thing we did there is we went to training with Red Bull, like, you know, the Bear base. We had one base with Red Bull, and they taught us how to put patches on bombed runways, jackhammers, torches. Yeah,
Not in your job description, but
it wasn't in my typical job description. So during alerts and exercises, we're out there on the flight line in full chem gear, simulating patching runways, putting aluminum patches on it.
in nuclear gear.
Oh yeah, full gear. Yeah,
With a Geiger counter that you.
yeah, close by. Yeah, so it was, that was one of the unique things about England is we had to cover for that function, and then, you know, the Red Horse people would send one or two guys to drive the heavy equipment, but all the grunt work was done by all, like, the electronics, the avionics guys, my guys.
A body is a body.
A body is a body at that point. They figured during war, you don't have to have something calibrated right now.
If the building is still there.
If the building's still there. So that was a unique thing about it, doing rapid runway repair is what it was called, you know.
So now you're done with the tour in England.
Okay. Back in the mid-'80s, they're trying to save some money. So they were asking people that were overseas to stay overseas, because it costs a lot of money to move families and everything else. And so I said, sure, I'll stay here. We're having a great time. And they said, no, you got to go. And they sent me to Phoenix, Arizona. And I was going to be working on a calibration laboratory, a small one, dedicated to the F-15E. If the Strike Eagle was brand new, I started working on it in 1986, and it became part of the Air Force inventory in 1990.
Interesting. Little gap in.
The avionics on it, it was all so new that no one knew how to work on it. Our pilots had to be trained on it. Our instructor pilots had to be trained by the McDonnell Douglas pilots. And all the engineers on the avionics had to work out all the bugs on maintaining the system. So I was there working in a small laboratory. And all we did, the deal was with this small laboratory, is if the aircraft deployed and avionics deployed with them, this small laboratory would go as well. And that wasn't normal. Normally you'd pick up support from the closest established lab, you know. But no, this was specialized enough that they wanted us to go with them. But we had to write the manuals and develop the procedures and make sure it all worked. So I worked with, and this is where I travel a lot to McDonnell Douglas in St. Louis, the Air Force Electronics in San Antonio, constantly back and forth for meetings and conferences with the engineers. What equipment do we need? How are we going to buy it? The military's got this 5-year thing on buying equipment. So this is where we get the $500 hammer. Because if you find out you have to have a hammer, well, the contractor will put the hammer in your mobilization kit, but you're going to pay for it. You know, and then now what we were talking about was something a lot more than a hammer, but there were times like that where they'd want me to do a measurement on part of their avionics systems, and the equipment I had wouldn't do it. it created arguments with some engineers between us and the engineers, and I had engineers from companies visiting me in Phoenix to walk in and see what we were trying to do and determine if they could or not. And I was busy. I was busy a lot. So I worked on it for 4 years, and then Desert Storm started. And the first squadron of F-15Es went to Seymour Johnson Air Force Base and then immediately flew overseas. And a guy that I had trained and worked with, I didn't train him, I guess I worked with him, was running the shop there. So 6 months later, I said, they're only doing 6 month tours, so I said, I'll volunteer to go to Saudi Arabia during Desert Storm with them, send me back to Phoenix. I had some job offers there, and I was getting close to the end of I was getting really close to 20 years. Mm-hmm. And if they'd send me back, then I'd go to Desert Storm. And they said, no. We want you to go with the next activation of F-15Es, which was supposed to be Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. I had no interest in going in the Western Pacific. And then a volcano blew up in the Philippines and destroyed Clark Air Force Base. So he says, well, we'll just advance to the next scheduled activation of F-15Es, and that's Anchorage, Alaska. I said, I'll stay 4 more years, and I'll go up there.
So you've been in Iceland. Now you're going to Alaska.
Yeah.
Apparently you're the cold weather man.
I found out that I prefer the cold over the heat because I was in Phoenix, and I'd been in South Carolina. Mm-hmm. And so alternating from a warm climate to a cold, I prefer the cold. I can always put on more clothes.
Right.
And
so Alaska. Once again, many people have many concepts about Alaska. You see the commercials on TV and whatever. Your experience with Alaska.
I drove up there pulling a trailer because I knew once I got there I was going to be, there were only going to be a lot of time, opportunities for leave. Absolutely gorgeous, and it's so big. And basically, except for the cities, there's so few people. There's a whole lot of nothing except for the wilderness, the wildlife, the rivers, the mountains, It was absolutely gorgeous. Moving to Anchorage, Anchorage is again on the water, so the temperatures are moderated. You don't get the super, super colds like you do in interior Alaska. You get periods of it, but most of the time it's moderated. So it was quite beautiful. The winters there in Anchorage, very similar to here, they were longer. They just last longer. But I really loved it. It was something to adapt to after Phoenix. The first winter was a little tough, but after that it was just great.
You did some unique things up there.
I did. What happened to me is I was working on just the F-15E, but then the fellow that ran the base calibration laboratory retired, and I got to looking, and I was the ranking E7 in my career field. I made E7 while I was in Phoenix, and I thought they kind of needed me over there. And so I went from a little 8-man operation to 54 people, and we were a regional depot for electronics for all federal agencies in the Northern Pacific. So it was a little different job, high stress. My wife had seen in the base paper they were looking for volunteers to help with the Natural Resource Office on the base. And she told me, she says, I'd like to do that. I'm not going by myself. So I went to the meeting, and it was turned out to be a great way to relieve stress. You know, I got to go out in the woods. I got to, just deal with the animals or and it turned out within 6 months I was kind of running the volunteers and all the field operations. Our base wildlife biologist and a contract administrator with civil engineers who had a degree in forestry, they were office bound, but they were responsible for this 13,000 acres of wilderness basically surrounding the base. And so they'd have things they needed done out in the woods, and the volunteers would do it. We had a lot of guys that liked doing patrols. We were augmented game wardens, just checking people following regulations, and the state people liked it because they didn't have to be out there checking fishing, hunting. We had a float plane base on our base, at one of our lakes, and so our people took care of monitoring all that. But I was the grunt crew. We had 10 black bears and 2 grizzlies with collars on them that we had to monitor and deal with up close and personal every now and then. We had timber sales. So I did all this on nights and weekends. And then it turned out that I was going to have to retire. And we knew this in advance because I did not go to Desert Storm. There was no opportunity for me to get promoted. In my career field, Air Force wide, only 3 people made E8 a year. And I was number 4 on the list for 3 years. So it's pretty obvious I was going to retire. I talked to the colonel in charge of aircraft maintenance and made a deal with him. I had 5 other E7s working for me. So I told him, my replacement is here, but which one do you want to have my job? A lot of customers. We had, I think 4 Coast Guard cutters, and then the Navy security group, the DEW line, which was contracted. We had everybody that we supported, and so I was juggling customers constantly, keeping everybody, making sure they all had what they needed. Might not always be what they wanted, but, and that included my own colonel, So I said, you need the personality to do this. So we worked it out that I farmed out my jobs to these other gentlemen. They'd come into work in the morning. By then, I'd have already been there. I'd leave them notes. I'd head for the woods. So I did this for almost 2 years. And I was on the radio, so if anything came up, they could call me in. So yeah, I chased bears and counted trees. And
as you say, there's thousands of acres around the base.
The base was 13,000 acres. About 4,000 of it was developed. That was where the flight line. The rest of it was woods.
Okay.
We had 6 lakes. Some of them had chalets on it for recreational purpose. We had snowmobile trails. Hunting was allowed on base, and that was an interest. All the wildlife belonged to the state. All the trees belonged to the BLM, and then the ground, the dirt, belonged to the DOD.
Okay.
So anytime you did anything with natural resources, you had several agencies you had to deal with. So hunting was allowed on the base. The state would issue permits, and then we'd manage the hunt. We had to know where they were. The hunters would have to, even if they were civilian, have to check in with one of our gates and tell them what area they're going to hunt. Fair enough. That was great.
For many different reasons. So you keeping track of animals and
safety.
A storm would come in or something.
If they didn't check out, then we'd go out and look and see if we could find at least where they were parked and find them in the evening. So we never lost anybody, but we had people didn't know exactly where they were on the base at times, and we'd lead them off, back to the gate. But so we had a lot of work out in the woods. And summer was busy. Salmon run. We had a salmon run went right through the middle of the base that we had to monitor for release, make sure enough salmon got up the stream. Poachers. They did actually catch someone poaching there. They caught him with 150 fish in the back of his pickup truck, and the state was very glad to see him, because that's something we didn't even we just called the state troopers. This one's yours. So I got to work outside a lot. Talked about, and I have bear stories. The 2 grizzlies were getting large. We got them as juveniles, collared, and they were doing grizzly things. They were killing moose calves in people's front yards and all that. So, working with the Army, Fort Richardson is right next to Elmendorf Air Force Base, and there's no fence, so the bears went back and forth freely. Working with the Army and the state, and all that, we decided to capture these 2 grizzlies and relocate them down to the Kenai Peninsula. So we actually, this is July, 24 hour sunlight. We actually got a dart into the mail about 2 in the morning one day, chased him down, stuck him in a culvert trap, a barrel trap overnight. And the next day they decided we're going to put him in an Army helicopter and take him down to the Kenai Peninsula. So we sedated him in the morning, put him on an Army medic stretcher, set him inside the helicopter, and took off. And it was a wildlife biologist, a state guy, myself, and the helicopter crew. And so we flew about 45 minutes. And so the wildlife biologist is talking to the pilot about where to land. And the bear woke up, sat up in the middle of the helicopter. And the games began. He was still pretty groggy, so I tell people that if he got me, he'd be without his ears, because that's what I had hold of. And I was sitting on his head, keeping him down. Mm-hmm. We landed abruptly, as fast as the helicopter pilot could put it down. Opened the door, and stretcher and everything right out the door. And that's where we left him.
So that helicopter, was that like a Huey, or was that a...
Yeah, the Huey. Yeah,
So it's the one that people are familiar when you say helicopter.
Oh, yeah. The Vietnam sitting on the edge, it was the same style.
And a bear.
And a bear, inside. Not on a sling, like you'd think. No, he was inside. And we had to kind of scrunch him up because side to side on that Huey, he was too big. As a 3-year-old, he was about 450 pounds. And his front claws were as long as my fingers. And his head was about that wide. He was a big boy.
Oh, yeah.
And so we slid him out, closed the door, took off, and the wildlife biologist looked at me. He says, "I've never had one do that to me before." I had 3 days before I went on terminal leave to retire.
So you were still doing this when you were on active duty?
Oh, yeah, it was because they were on base, and we had to manage the wildlife on base, even though there is no job description that says that. So all these things, managing wildlife, I was certified by the state to do it. The state trained us. And I had a lot of people doing it in the evenings and on weekends, but there was just 1 or 2 of us that was available during the week, during the day. Moose in a schoolyard, run the moose off, just
You're in your turf.
doing wildlife habitat improvements, encouraging willow growth, moose browse, salmon runs. We did a lot of work. The snowmobile trails, yes, there were days, a couple times during each winter, I think I need to check the snowmobile trails. Head out and spend the day doing that.
So you got out in Alaska.
So I retired up in Alaska. I'd been doing all this wildlife and forestry work because I did salvage forestry timber sales because of the beetle kill, which you hear. And but I needed a degree to do it now that I was retired. When you're in the military, you can do anything the military tells you to do. Mm-hmm. You're kind of covered. But I needed a degree to do it as a civilian. Talking to the people up there, there was no school at the time certified forestry. And I decided forestry rather than wildlife because to get a job, you really needed a master's in wildlife. and I'm in my 40s now. So I said, and I enjoy yes, I got my picture in the paper with bears and all that, but that wasn't really my style. I really enjoyed forestry work, and so there wasn't a school in Alaska, so many of the people in the BLM, the foresters in the BLM and all that, I talked to them, and they told me to go to Montana. So I went down to the University of Montana in Missoula, Montana, and got a bachelor's in forestry, which brought me here.
And into Wisconsin.
Yeah. The year I graduated, President Clinton did a executive order to save roadless areas, and it was written, worded a little bit funny, where the U.S. Forest Service couldn't drive on U.S. Forest Service roads out west. So we were basically told we didn't have a job anymore. They fixed it, but it took a year. And so I found a research job with the U.S. Forest Service here in town. So I worked here for 16 years.
Retired from there?
And then retired from there.
So quite a career in electronics to trees.
Yeah, exactly. So completely different. And the way I laugh about it, I went from a job in a building with no windows to working with no windows. So that's the thing that's similar about them.
Right.
So,
military career. Happy you did it?
Happy I did it, not for everybody. I fully accept that the military is not for everyone. It's a certain discipline, frame of mind, that it's not for everybody. But I grew up with it. Mm-hmm. It was very simple to me, and it worked well for me. I was able to be in charge. We won't talk about that part of it, But for the most part, the supervisors I had, if you did a good job, you got rewarded for it. If you didn't, they corrected. Okay, and that's the way I was raised, and so I feel that I work that way as a supervisor. Okay. That I gave my people credit. But it's not for everybody, but it is a great place to start for somebody. If you're looking to go away from home, to find a trade, a craft, education benefits, all that, the military is a great place to start. Yeah.
Did you use a GI Bill for Montana school?
I actually did. Because I was active duty continuously, I was still eligible to use the Vietnam era GI Bill when I went to school in the 90s. So that, Montana's not one of the most expensive schools. And so that paid for my school.
No college debt.
No college debt, yeah. I took a loan out for my first semester, and it was, and that was it. Just to give the GI Bill time to catch up to me.
Right. Anything else you want to talk about, Will?
No, that pretty much covers it, I've loved working here in Wisconsin. I've lived all over the country, and when I moved here as a forester, it was the first time I lived in the Midwest. And so I've lived all different parts of the country. They all have their good parts. They all have their bad parts. But people ask me if I like it here. I says, well, I've lived here 3 times longer than anywhere else in my life. So I've kind of gotten into the Wisconsin thing.
Well, thank you for your service.
Oh,
and thank you for
thank you for having me.
And thank you very much for watching. Have a good day.